This meeting will be on AM, let's see, it'll be on AO 2015-59. Let's go around and identify ourselves for the record. Mr. Hall, sir.
Ernie Hall, Assembly.
Jennifer Johnson. Julia Tucker, Assembly Council. Amy Demboski.
Elvie Gray Jackson.
Dick Training.
Pete Peterson.
Oh. Bill Evans.
Tim Potter. Jerry Weaver, Community Development. Tyler Robinson.
Good.
Jim Ferguson, Chair of Planning and Zoning.
Welcome to the meeting, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Hall, I'm turning it over to you to run it.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this, Mr. Trainer. For those of you in the audience, just a bit of a background. As assembly members, we're never allowed to speak to more than 2 other assembly members on any topic. And these work sessions are the only opportunity that we have to just sit and share with each other what we may be doing, what we're doing. And it has to be done in a public setting. That's kind of how I want to do this work session today. I want to give some understanding about why it was that Skandowski and I introduced this particular ordinance. But I want to begin and share some stuff that brought me to this point. I'm close to 5.5 years on the body, and I, like Ms. Johnson, have got 1 foot out of the door. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of going out of the door with a bit of frustration because I don't think I've done what I wanted to do when I came in the door. And part of that is the system. I was in the custom cabinet business for 40 years. So I have had a very close contact with development, contractors, not very much on a residential level, but casework and institutional buildings all through town. National Bank of Alaska, most of the lobbies that you go into, my company built the casework. So I've been a part of this for a long time. And the one thing that was always kind of frustrating to me was I was constantly would have designers come to me and they would have this incredible design. And I would look at it and I would tell them, I love it, but I can't build it. You can draw a flying horse, but me building it and making it fly proves to be extremely difficult on occasion. And I'm relating that to a degree to Title 21 and the Title 21 process. On coming on this body, I was immediately assigned to the Title 21 committee. I mean, logical. This guy's been kind of in the industry his entire life, and I go and I sit in meetings, and we're doing the process. We're trying to wrap up what's going on 11, going on to 12 years of developing a Title 21. And in every meeting, what I saw were kind of negotiations going on. Most of the time, the meeting was made up of a lot of the same people on a regular basis. And we did a lot of negotiating in that, if you would like to build 60, maybe we only want to do 35, and we compromise at 45. The problem with that process is the fact that I'm not a builder, nor am I a developer. And when I'm sitting there and I'm working through this process and I see it coming down, what I do see a lot of time is reading body language of individuals in that meeting. And I'm talking about body language of staff as well as body language of builders and developers, where you sit there and you say, okay, we're going to compromise, but it makes no sense. If we need to settle, we'll settle, but this makes no sense. And what we end up doing in this process is, I think we've written a Title 21, quite honestly, that's a flying horse. And when it comes down to a developer or a builder literally trying to apply what we, and when I'm talking to we all are elected officials, but unfortunately we're not given this vast amount of knowledge when we get elected, but we deal with everything that affects everyone's lives. And a lot of the content that we're talking about, we really don't have the background to do it, to be able to do it logically. I think staff does a remarkable job considering what it is that we draft, make law out of, and give it to them. And a lot of times we're handing them a flying horse as much as we are builders and developers. I want this community to be developed world class. I think we overreact. We had a period of time where we had some really bad players in our community building projects, and they did a god-awful job. But we can't punish everybody because of what happened back then. I think one of the best things that we could do as a body is draft a common sense clause that we would apply to staff that would give them the leniency and the leeway to make some decisions on the fly that would be able to move projects ahead. I appreciated the mayor in his recent interview talking about wanting to get building going, and he knew we dealt with black and white, but when we're in that gray area, let's tend to go with the builders. Ladies and gentlemen, we haven't left a lot of gray area here. I mean, at the end of the day, we've been pretty specific. I think we need to work hard as an elected body to be more descriptive rather than prescriptive in what we're doing. Because the reality is, during the time that I was on this committee, on more than one time, we had architects come in and literally share with us that, you know, honestly, we feel we're being stifled and that we're not allowed to really use our creativity in projects that we're doing because you're being so specific about how we can place it on a lot or how high we can build it or where we put the doors and windows. So after 5.5 years, I'm just sharing with you what I'm feeling here. Another place that we fall terribly short is there are studies and testing and quite honestly a lot of infrastructure that we need to be dealing with as a community and as elected officials that we keep laying off onto our builders and developers because we're not willing to provide the infrastructure that's needed to do it. The good thing is, in spite of it, we still get projects done, but I have no idea what costs, to be honest with you. We need to work hard. Now, in AO 59, I've worked with the developers through the Live, Work, Play for 18 months. I've listened to them. I heard their pain. We came and did a work session. Everybody heard what they requested or what they asked. So, not having that knowledge, what I did was I went to Mr. Potter, Tim Robbins at Cook Inlet Housing, who does a tremendous amount of development in this community. Mr. Potter's involved in a lot, and I said, you need to draft for me what you're looking for here. So that's why I got them here today. I want them to help explain to you why they've done what they did, the thought process behind it. I asked Mr. Ferguson to be here because planning and zoning has reviewed this. They've moved it to us. They've suggested a couple of changes. I think they're still waiting for a final amendment, Mr. Ferguson, or some final detail.
We're waiting for the corrected resolution.
Right.
We should get a week from Monday, and we'll sign off on that and pass that on.
Okay. Yes. So we want to be able to be sure to work with you. But what I would like at this point in time is to give Tyler and Tim, and Tyler, I think it was an attorney out at Cook Inlet that actually drafted this, but you both were very involved in it. And so I want you to share with us a bit of why you got to this point. I particularly want to have you address the deal that we're looking at setting building standards aside. And that's not where we're taking employee building standards out of the door by no stretch of the imagination. And also the zoning, what type of structures we're dealing with this. So if one of you would lead off and the other follow, I would appreciate it. And then we'll give this body a chance to quiz. Go ahead.
And I'm going to pass out, thank you, Ernie, I can pass out a memo that I put together because I figured at some point the question was going to come up on, how do you all deal with 0049 and 0059 at the same time? Is in fact 0059 no longer necessary because, and I don't think it's called 0049 anymore, 072 or whatever those numbers are. So I try to lay some issues out there, and I would just say that it's an unusual position for Cook-Inlet to be here, but we're here because we're the only ones that have permitted 2 projects to the new code. One is built, one is about ready to get under construction this weekend. We closed the deal today, and we've looked at in the interim. We've also looked at, and that accounts for about 86 units. We've also in the interim permitted 181 units that we brought through the old code. So even though we are an affordable housing provider and we have affordable and senior units in each of those projects that constitute that 181, and there are some parking efficiencies that you gain through the new code, we chose to go old code because of some of the constraints in the new code. And I think it's important that I can walk you through specific projects, and you will be bored to death as I do that. But I think what I want to communicate, number one, is we think we do good projects. We do mixed-use projects, we do multifamily, we do townhouse projects. We believe in community development as well as just building good housing. The last thing we want to do is build something that the community says, we don't like what you did there. You're not invited back. Because I'm the guy that has to go to the community councils and talk about our projects. That's not what we're trying to do. But in the course of getting different lots, and we're down to dealing with different lots that are odd sized, odd shaped, odd access, you have to have enough flexibility to do the design of the buildings. And so much of the new code is oriented around, and I don't know how familiar you are with, I'm a planner is my background, but the term new urbanism and urbanized context, where really it's sort of a neo-traditional downtown type paradigm that encourages walkability, sidewalks on the street, street fronts, entrances, rather than a sea of parking with buildings back behind. We've never tried to do that. And I think, that said, we have a very different town that's grown up around, other than downtown, it's grown up entirely around the automobile, which differentiates us from a lot of other cities our size. It's not uncommon to see suburban areas like that, but cities. And so what happens is when you take this kind of idealistic context that is this urbanized area and want everything to be street facing, and then you drive down Spinard Road and you realize there's no parking on Spinard Road. There are no side streets that will accommodate parking. You still have to accommodate 100% of your parking off-site on the lot. It becomes very challenging to do that type of development. And I will tell you that I can go through our existing projects, but we just started laying out another project in Spinard that we've been talking about with members of the community for years because we've assembled parcels and they're contaminated parcels and they're platting and all that kind of stuff. And we started to lay it out and we've come to believe that we're going to need a variance and an alternative equivalent compliance approach, which is sort of the safety valve that is in the code, because we don't meet many of the initial standards that are inherent in the design standards, whether that has to do with orientation to the street, location of parking, placement on a lot, all of those things. And I can give you very good reasons of why we're taking our approach. The reasons are we want to do mixed use. And we think if we're forced to do what we're going to do, we're actually going to lose units and build more commercial than we think the lot can handle, or frankly that the market can handle in that location. The curve in the road is a reason why we think there's a problem. The road itself that is just terrible, that we all want to see fixed, doesn't accommodate the type of development that this code calls for. And so we're stuck. And so the reason why we say, frankly, set the building standards aside is we want the approach to be. Jerry's shown the testing. Okay, the testing takes an individual building and a specific part of the code and says, does this comply with articulation? Does this comply with building orientation? And that's not fundamental to design. When you do design, you look at the site, you take a step back, and you look at all of those things in total. You don't look at just any one of those things. And what we're finding is when we go and try to put the whole thing together, we get stuck. And so when we came up with this ordinance, Tim and I helped draft this stuff. I went line by line as an employee to Jerry to help draft it. And now I've sat on the other side and tried to put projects together. And it has been incredibly frustrating, but also enlightening. And so I think, last night I went and pulled up Boise and read their zoning code. Now they're a little bit smaller than we are as a city, but bigger than us as a metro area. They're also a western city that's grown a lot post-World War II. And I read it, and what stood out to me is I understood everything I read immediately. I didn't get to this point where I said, what in the heck are they driving at there? I knew immediately what they were going to. And if they had special parts in their community that they wanted to have special design guidelines, they put those on a map and they called them out. And they'll say, this area will develop with these particular design guidelines. We'll buffer the single-family neighborhoods on these perimeter areas. But within here are the design standards. But the other stuff just goes in, and you got to articulate, you got to deal with building mass, and we're going to be adults, and we're going to deal with it at the counter. And there's going to be accountability on both sides, which is something we've always struggled with in this town, both on the staff side and the developer side. I'll pay witness to that. But you do it in such a way where it just makes sense. And I really am a firm believer that if people like all of us sitting here that aren't technicians have trouble reading through this stuff, it's a problem. It shouldn't be that hard to understand. And Tim and I both agree with every single one of the purpose and intent statements in this code, every single one of them. It's not the issue. We want to implement the comprehensive plan. We're frankly having trouble doing it. So, I can get into, that's ultimately why we said we were just frustrated. And when Mr. Dowski and Mr. Hall came to us after we presented some of that frustration and said, do something about it, that was our first step forward. I think the memo outlines some things that we think it does and are needed. Some of the small lot changes. I have a duplex with a detached garage and a unit above a garage that I could permit tomorrow if I had setbacks reduced to 5 feet in the R3. Which, by the way, by right approves a fourplex on a 7,000 square foot lot. It's not like we're asking for something that shouldn't already be granted. So I think, I am sharing our frustration. I know we're at a tough spot, and the only thing I can say is when you go line by line and you debate issues kind of in a vacuum, and I've been a part of those conversations, you don't end up with necessarily a good product at the end. I can spend all day baking a cake, and that doesn't mean it's going to taste good. And so I think that I don't know what the solutions are, but if we are stifling creativity or the challenging, so frankly our lot layouts, they're not easy to deal with. Our requirements for traffic and fire are in fact higher than what most communities have, because you'll hear, well, we have snow and we have this and that and the other. Our costs are insurmountably almost higher than other places. And so that's where the frustration comes from. So that was our step forward. It wasn't to blast all this stuff away, but it was to unclog the system a little bit, take a step back and maybe say, hey, some of this stuff just overly prescriptive. Can we get by? I can show you a picture of a building that no one in this room would say there's not enough articulation to achieve kind of a reduction in massing. And yet when we stood in front of the UDC, staff said, no, it doesn't meet the standards. Because what was happening was we had a vestibule that was blocking what would otherwise be articulated in a building if I were to take the vestibule away. So now what am I supposed to do? Articulate the vestibule on top of that? Common sense, right? Common sense. And so again, it was on that, and that's where that frustration comes from. So can we just get, instead of saying every 30 feet we got to, is there something easier that we can take a step back to? And if we get there, then I'll accept, I'll be the one to say, let's accept it back. But until we do, I think we're going to be driving the stuff that adds costs unnecessarily, creates conflict between me and Jerry's staff to say, why are we arguing about this? Frankly, it was a UDC commissioner that said, this is dumb. We get it. You've done, if you achieve it, let's not bicker over this stuff. This is a great project. So anyway, I've taken up too much of your time. I'm happy to take other questions, but that's how we got to where we are and why we're trying to move this ball back up the hill.
I just wanted to give my little piece, and most of it's going to be maybe not totally specific issues, but taking the longer view of white hair and what wisdom that may or may not give you over time. That here we have a comprehensive plan, which the community vetted through the process. This indicates what they want, and Tyler said it. And he and I are really responsible for trying to bring projects forward that implement this plan. And the new code, in its prescriptive way, I think unknowingly, I don't think anybody did it on purpose, has created a situation that is too complex and piles on in areas that you would never imagine when you added things together. Instead of 1 + 1 makes 2, it adds up to 14. And it was probably as much a surprise to us as it was to the staff when we went back to them and said, you know, number one, what does this mean? And did you realize this? For instance, in the R4 or R zoning district, if you start at 1 as an FAR, there's not enough bonus points available to get to 2, which is what the code says you can do as a maximum. Well, why would you ever create something that says, hey, you know, by the way, you know, you used to be able to do an FAR of 2. We reduced it to 1, but we're giving it back to you because you're going to be able to get these bonus points by doing these things that we think are important for the design. But the trick is, we didn't know and you don't know that you can't get to 2. That means to me that nobody tested it. And I will sit here and tell you that the private sector begged, pleaded, and even spent some of their own money on the limited testing that has been done in the last 13.5 years. Mayor Begich put together a real estate task force, and it was made up of a variety of people, including bankers and real estate people and developers, to do that. We put up some of our own money. The mayor put up 25 grand to match, and there were 3 projects in each category: residential, commercial, and industrial, evaluated. That was a long time ago, probably at least 10 years ago. It's early on in the process. And, you know, all due respect to Jerry, but when the memo says that all of this has been vetted and it's been calculated and analyzed and everything else, I'll sit here and say bullshit. Because it hasn't been tested. The only people that have actually tested anything are Cook Inlet Housing and Widener Development and a couple of others partially. Widener hasn't even completed getting the projects designed that they're proposing to bring forward. So you've got 2 projects that Cook Inlet has done. Those are true tests. Widener has done about a 35% design on their City View 2 project. And the Country Lane project that's been referred to has maybe a 5 or 10% concept design. And I can tell you that the concept has changed dramatically given what they've started to try and look at again. So it's out of frustration that I sit here and try and explain that in order to get to this, it's my absolute belief, based on history, background, and knowledge, that we will end up 50% or more shy of the density that we called out for being needed in the community in this document, because of the design standards that are included in Title 21 that have not been tested. And, you know, a fear I have is that the transit-supported corridors is one of the biggest things that's going to come out of the land use plan map. That will be a positive thing for the future of this town. And yet, I don't believe there's been any testing on any of these corridors to look at the current layout of the development and the lots that are available and what may be able to happen. On the basis of this, if you're within 200 feet of a variety of zoning districts, including single-family residential, you have to do something different. And between the shading, the transition requirements of the structure and that, you will not be able to get anywhere close to the density that's called for in the 2020 plan, let alone what this community is going to need in the next 50 years. So as we take a comprehensive plan, and this is one of my planning beefs, is that every community takes a 20-year horizon for a comprehensive plan, projects a growth rate out, says that's how many units of this we're going to have. And that's a plan for 20 years. The city's not going to die and go away after 20 years. It's going to be here. So we need to take that 20 years into account, but also keep the door open for thought in the future. The other thing that I have a real distinct problem is that when you get to prescriptive requirements in a menu that require you to do certain design things, I can also tell you that out of the designs that you could do in this town, I love modern design. I like craftsmen also. But I do not believe that the current design standards in this code for residential and multifamily would allow you to do a truly streamlined, modern structure. It would just not meet the requirements. And that's too bad, in my opinion. Why are we taking and limiting the creativity of the architects? I'd almost rather have a gatekeeper like Jerry say, here's the description of what we'd like to have. You go do it, bring it in, and I'll pass judgment on it. I'd much prefer that type of thing. To say, am I meeting kind of the general descriptive nature of where this town is trying to go? Another concern that I have is in this wedding cake terrace back for the daylighting plane and the transition, there's a basic requirement of at least a 16-foot dimension on that terrace setback. And that's an arbitrary number. I think it reflects the 3 to 5 foot plane as rise to reach that's been projected. But I don't think it has anything to do with actually what happens on the inside of that structure and how you lay out both the structural components of the building or the plumbing or the heating, any of the mechanical system. Which from a cost standpoint, when you can stack those and gang those into a column or a corridor, you can get the beneficial use of that, and it's economical to do. If you set back the structure and it doesn't have to be on top of a structural wall, then you have to reinforce the structure below it to hold up that structure that's landing not on a wall. And that adds cost to the project. And those are the types of things that I don't believe were taken into account when a lot of these things were done. And I think we said it at the assembly work session that individually, all of these design standards seem innocent as can be, and we'd all sit around and say, yeah, fine, fine, fine. But when you get them cumulatively and you actually take a real project on a real piece of property that has all the limitations that Tyler's talked about, it becomes real, and it's a hell of a challenge. And I think we're coming out with more expensive and in many cases a lesser design response to the site specific and to the community than we should be doing. So the intent of what Tyler and I, with Henry's help, did over a weekend was to say, we don't want the design standards to go away. Don't just wipe them off the map. But we think that there's enough work that needs to be done to clean this up and figure out what's really doing by taking some real testing to it. That why don't we suspend that part of the code for a known period of time, do the hard work that needs to get done, fund the testing that needs to be done, and get on with life so that we're actually reflecting where the community said they wanted to go. Because there's no sense saying this is where we want to be, but we've made the rules so different and so complex that you can't actually do what we wanted to have you do. How silly is that? So I want you to take the long view. We're not just here for the 2020 plan and to 2020. We should be looking out there a long ways. And when we develop at a lower density now on a piece of property, we lock that piece of property up for the next 30 to 50 or more years. And that opportunity to add density on that site is gone. So it has to be made up somewhere else. That's where I came forward with the discussion about unlimited height. Now, do I believe that unlimited height is right for everywhere in town? No. We suggested and put into it caveats that would say, if you have to be in one of the designated centers, employment centers, or town centers, or downtown, to be able to do that. So we actually tried to use this policy map as our land use plan map, because we don't have a land use plan map yet. So another, in deference to Jerry, if you were really going to do this right, I think it was done totally out of sequence. And the comp plan should have been followed by a land use plan map, and then with clarifying code to implement where you wanted to get to in the plan map. And now we've done a code that doesn't necessarily take into account all the issues that would have come up if we would have discussed and had the public discussion of the land use plan map. So we're caught in this hole, and what happens now is that if we don't pass something of some sort quickly, there are some very good projects that are not going to be done in the next year or two. If someone isn't into hard design starting like today, they cannot get their project designed and permitted to start for next year construction. So even though the sun's out, the snow's gone out of the mountains, it's almost too late for next construction season. And if it's a very large, complex project like the Country Lane project that Whitehaven would like to do, it's likely they've lost 2 years if we don't have some clarification. So that was the intent. Am I married to the unlimited heights? No. Can I live with what's been discussed out of the 049 with the adjustments that have been done? Probably can. But I think everybody needs to keep in mind that we're in a situation where every time we build a structure on a piece of property, if it's half of the density that it could have been, that robbed us, because that density is going to have to be made up somewhere else in the future. And if it was a better location to put it here with all the benefits, parks, proximity to employment, everything else, the right thing to do would be to put it there, not spread it out and have bigger impacts on the rest of the community. That's all I'm asking people to do, take that into consideration.
Mr. Ferguson, we send all of this to your committee to review.
Yeah, thanks. I've worked on Title 21 for 12 years. 10 years as a citizen and 2 years on planning and zoning. I supported the new Title 21 when it came before planning and zoning. I voted for it. I look forward to see the projects come forward. In my opinion, it's broken and needs help. I'm going to use an analogy that is a team building effort. We decide we should have dinner together. Everybody decides that's a good idea. Let's have dinner together. And we had a further discussion that we should maybe have spaghetti for our dinner. So we all agree to have spaghetti for our dinner. We've got a consensus right now and everybody's in favor. We go into the kitchen, we put a big pot in the kitchen, and Albie Gray pours her spices.
Gray Jackson.
I'm sorry, Albie Gray Jackson. Pours her spices in the pot, walks away. Mr. Traney pours his spices in the pot, walks away. These are all good spices. They're all great individually. By the time we get to Mr. Evans putting his spices in the pot, dinner isn't too good. And that is what we have managed to develop with this menu. I had to go back and try to decide, because I had worked on this thing. I have never worked as long and hard on something as I did this. As in, where did we fail? And we failed in with these menu choices. We took the designer out of the equation. We took the training of the architect and we moved his training from the equation for her. And so that's where I'm coming from. And that's where I think something needs to be fixed. My background is I'm a civil engineer. I'm a licensed general contractor. I am not a planner. I am not an attorney. So I look at this slightly different. I look at this with a sense of urgency. In August of last year, we had a good work session. We heard what the problems were. Here we are in July of the next year, and those problems aren't fixed. I think we've got to get them fixed. We've got to get them fixed faster than we're doing right now. And this is, up to this point, the two new Title 21 fixes planning and zoning had seen this year. One dealt with a menu board location for drive-thrus, and the second dealt with a boat sale location issue. And that is not fixing the problem. And so, back to the committee and everything else, there ought to be a process that if somebody has a problem, there is somebody who is not have a pride of authorship, looks at it, says, yeah, that's a problem, here's a fix. Bam, bam, in a month we get through the 2 months probably to get through. We get through the process, but it gets fixed. But we're not doing that. We're sitting here in this pot stewing. And that's my concern. I don't know if, I'm not smart enough to tell you whether a 1.5 FAR or a 1.75 FAR is the magic bullet, or whether it should be unlimited or 70 foot. You know, I can read the law and interpret it, but we've got to get this thing moving forward to get fixed. And that's simply where I come from.
Thank you. Mr. Weaver, you get to be the last guy. You've been pressing through all
I
this.
appreciate Tyler and Jim being here today. You know, there was considerable testing done. We've given you the testing. Staff's spending in order to testing. Our project's easy to evaluate and hold up to the threshold.
Jerry, can you speak a little louder? We're getting old.
We looked at.
She is.
I don't want to bring up any specific cases, but there are cases processing that you will eventually see here that these provisions protect those neighborhoods. That the light plane is extremely important. We've calibrated and recalibrated it with the 2015-76. Our community doesn't need unlimited height in these zoning districts. And we talked there, most people talked about building standards and that building venue choice. I gave you the graphic that shows the majority of this project that you see on a graphic of about 40 projects. Majority met. You talk about Country Lane. We changed the ordinance for that project. So as far as I know, the city wasn't the impediment in that project yet.
They identified
Let me just finish up with it. But that height to make it something more than what our old code was is not reasonable. The old code and the new code is presently in place today. The developers can choose to use the old code or new code. Developers choose to use the new code because of the reduced parking. That's a big issue, but and that's important, and it should have been reduced because it's calibrated to the uses. But at the same time, when you do that, you're putting densification into these communities with less parking in an urban environment. And I did appreciate your comments, Tyler, where that urban environment is, because it isn't everywhere. That perhaps some of that, those choices have to recognize that our whole community isn't that urban of an environment. So maybe that was a fault in that. But I would, last parting comments, if you're going to do anything, and I know it always takes more work and no one wants to go back and look at this again, but if you want to look at the design standards, you look at the design standards. Don't throw in the FARs, don't throw in the unlimited height, leave it the way it was calibrated in the new code, because from my evaluation of it, those FARs and those heights, we will easily, and our community will look the way the comprehensive plan projected us to look like. That there's no need to take those. Are there areas of the R3, R4 where the setbacks can be changed? Yes, we've done that. We've agreed that in 2015-76. So we're acknowledging that. And it's like I said up front early, we have good working relationship with a lot of our developers in the community. We want to see good development. And it was kind of a complex process that went through. We have architects and engineers that wanted the menu choice. That it went through all these imaginations, and that's what we came up with. But and there are other little nuances of properties like the Tyler brought up in this Bernard Road that are challenges to me, I say we change the ordinance. We have the ability to change the ordinance. And no, those other communities, I'm not sure what Boise does. I know they have some very, very progressive development that they have seen. But some of those other communities, they don't use a czar, a bureaucratic czar. It's a commission that you have to go to, which is another layer, which we didn't want to do because our construction season is so short. We wanted it prescriptive, the choice is there to be able to choose and move forward, and that's what we prefer.
Thank you. Mr. Maskey.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I just want to go back. Part of the problem we have here is we have a little bit of political grandstanding going on in the public and people fear-mongering. And so I want to address those right out the gate. So, when we hear people say we're throwing out the design standards, it doesn't mean we're going to have willy-nilly building shanty towns in Anchorage. It's just, that's not how I see it. Tyler, I'm looking at you specifically because this is actually in the form of a question, so I want you to kind of address my points regarding design standards and setting that aside and the impact you see for the community as that happens during the 18-month period or whatever month period it is that we really work on these, because I'm hopeful that we do. The other is the comment that I hear is this is essentially if AO 2015-59 goes forward, essentially this is gutting Title 21 and it's throwing it out. I don't see it that way at all. I see that we're addressing 3 issues, and I disagree with Jerry. I'm not a builder. You have way more experience in this than I do, being a planner. But I see by looking at the FAR and going back to essentially the old Title 21, I think that will help some of the things that that Mr. Potter pointed out, in that, it said you could build it to a 2, but if in fact the menu doesn't allow you to get up to a 2, it's a problem in some of these projects. And when they can articulate that and they come to me, I don't think he's lying to me. I think he's actually tested that portion and looked at it and said, okay, I can't quite get there. So when I hear that as a legislator, I say, okay, we have a problem. Let's go back and let's look at that. So let me finish. And so, when I see the FAR, it doesn't scare me to go back and look at that. I do not have the 7 years of experience with Ms. Johnson, but I've made it very clear I'm not a fan of the menu option. Maybe someday somebody will explain it to me and I become the biggest cheerleader of it. But at this point, it's not really. I would have gone the other direction. I was not on the body at the time. And the other thing, when I talk about so we have, the design standards, Tyler, that I want you to talk about. Is this really throwing out Title 21 or gutting it? And the unlimited height in our work session, which you were at, many of us sitting around the table agreed that we could very comfortably put height restrictions in many of these areas. And, so that was actually pretty much resolved, I felt, at that meeting, and Mr. Hall was going to bring forward an amendment to reflect that. So I think we're addressing a lot of these issues as we have these conversations. Unfortunately, it gets bantered about and presented in other fashions elsewhere. So can you just talk about those 3 things and kind of, because I know there's a lot of members of the public here and they're scared. They hear that and they're like, oh no, is a 50, story building going to be built right next to my house? So.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps as Tim said, sort of wrote this quickly following the work session that we had with you all, and frankly, the one thing that we talked about suspending are the design standards. There are a lot of things that actually aren't in that section that is referenced in that ordinance that were I to do it over again, I might actually go back and include them. So it actually doesn't set as much aside as people think it does. You still have the open space requirements, and again, it's not that we haven't had open space requirements, it's that we haven't had descriptors of open space, qualifiers, I guess. So it's things like, the articulation, the actual what the building looks like. But there is building orientation that's not proposed to be suspended. There's lots of other things within the code that persist. All the other stuff. That was the thing that we identified as most problematic. I think as we move 059 forward and other ordinances, I still think we ought to look at some of those other things. And I'll just give you one little example that came in front of the commission the other night. As one of the 6 or 7 descriptors of common private open space. So there's 6 things to get there. Common private open space shall be conveniently accessible to residents or users of the development. I'd be fine if it ended right there. But it doesn't end there. The nearest building facade to the open space, any facade sharing a corner with the nearest building facade, or any facade directly facing the open space shall have a primary entrance. A walkway shall connect common private open space to primary building entrances. Really. So what and staff is totally opposed to getting rid of that language. They say, how will we know? You know, a developer will come in and argue that you've provided accessible open space, and it becomes a debate at the counter. And I'll say, look, if I just came in with an 8.5 acre tract, if I put it all in the northwest corner and you called me on it, totally defensible, you say no, you run up to your boss, they're going to back you up, you're going to have backup for that. But in the meantime, I've had to orient my entrances to the other side, to the street, because that's the other part of the code. And so this is an example of how you get, those are the things I want to check. And if at the end of the day, 2 years from now, we suddenly realize, you know what, there's been all of this abuse of common private open space. It's now accessible, but we'd prefer to have more eyes on the street, on it, or something to that effect. Then let's change it. But those are the types of things that I want to go in and simplify, that I think still keeps the primary intent of what we were trying to achieve, and helps me say, yeah, I'm with you on that. And as Tim said, I'm willing to stand in front of the Urban Design Commission. I'm willing to go to Jerry's staff and say, look, folks, let me explain. In fact, I'd like to invite his staff to start sitting in on some of our early design meetings as we work through this stuff to see how you put these projects together, because it's instructive. But so I hopefully that answers your question. We're not throwing it all out, but we are trying to say, take the thing that is the most complicated and put it aside. And that doesn't mean, I'll give you, here's an example. Mixed-use buildings that we did a couple of years ago in Mountain View, on Mountain View Drive, and everyone, you know, a lot of people, at least those in Mountain View, held them up. Thank you for doing these, is what we've been asking for. This building's not articulated at all. Not at all. I think it still looks okay. This building across the street is articulated. So we've got two different buildings. I'm not sure that this one meets the articulation standards, because we've gotten so specific on where, you know, let's take a step back and figure that out. That's what we're trying to do. And I would defer to Tim on the FAR. We don't build. Cook Inlet Housing typically does not have the resources to build to the FAR limits that we're talking about. I've not even calculated what our highest FAR is. I don't know what it is. But we haven't done, you know, a downtown project yet. We'd like to. You know, maybe that's where we start to see FAR issues butt up against the code. But mostly we're doing 3- and 4-story buildings, and we're not getting to the, you know, we're not going 70, 90 feet on these projects.
And just to respond to the FAR question and height, you know, I look at FAR and height as almost self-limiting by virtue of the market, the cost, and the building codes. And that's why you don't see a whole bunch of tall buildings all over town right now. In all the places that Jerry's talked about that he doesn't really want to have tall buildings. It's not the market, there's building code issues, and that's not where you derive the return that you need to cover the cost of doing that kind of construction. So I think I'm realistic in believing that the market will take care of that. I don't have a problem with the building heights that the committee talked about putting in. But the FAR is important so that you can try and get the number of units within the building that you need to have to be able to do it. And if you read what the transit supported corridors requires, from the center line of that, you go a quarter mile each way, and within that corridor, the average density of residential development is supposed to be 8 dwelling units per acre. If we're going down Arctic Boulevard and a bunch of these single-family homes, guess what? Where it is possible to build that, to meet that density requirement, you're going to have to put a lot of units there. If we're on transit and it makes sense to put smaller units in it so that there are singles, the young professionals, those kind of things, great. And you need the floor area ratio to get the volume of the building to put the units in, and or have common space inside the building or whatever it may be. So there's going to be tweaks. I mean, if we pass 2015-076 or whatever it is, I can tell you that the next project that goes through the system is going to find another 10 things, and we're going to be back here again. And this 18 months suspension was hopeful to be the thing that would allow projects that need to get going, I'm confident that the developers, at least that I'm working with, that are proposing projects, and the projects I know, are not going to build crap. It's not going to be the Ken Duffus, and I guess this is on the record, so sue me, Ken Duffus and Lee Baker. It's not that component, so I'm not going to be embarrassed by what we're going to bring forward to the community. But those projects may not be able to go forward if we don't do something.
Just a follow-up, Mr. Chair.
If we can do it quickly, I've got a couple other people in the queue, and if I run over, Mr. The Chairman will never give me this courtesy again.
Just to follow up, I just want to say to all members of the committee, you know, we have made this commitment that we're going to be meeting much more frequently. I don't know if it's going to be weekly or bi-weekly, but it's going to be more frequently. And I did have a discussion, Mr. Chair, with the Chair of Planning and Zoning earlier. And Tyler and I had this discussion, the whole Title 21 committee had this discussion at the last meeting, is we really want 2 members of Planning and Zoning to be sitting in our Title 21 committee meetings, because what we notice is we're operating in a vacuum and they're trying to understand what we did and the reasons behind it. And so it would be helpful for us to be more collaborative. And it's not just that. We want staff at the table, we want P&Z at the table, and we want the assembly there trying to solve this, because we're all in it together. So that's something that I hopefully we'll see at the next Title 21 meeting.
Thank you. We got Mr. Peterson. Were you in the queue? Mr. Evans.
Oh, thanks. I'm going to write a book at some point. Had an idea for it. It's called The Death of Competence. Because, and this issue is, you know, sort of the same as the SAP issue that the city faces, where you have big, complex things, and we seem to have a complete inability to handle them anymore. I'm not sure when that started or why it started, but I get that sense with at least those 2 things. I'm glad to say I wasn't around for the whole 30 years that Title 21 was in the works, or for the amount of time that the committee spent on it. It's really clear to me. I'm a lawyer. I write for a living. I was given a copy of Title 21 when I was put on that committee, and it's this thick, and it's dense, and it doesn't read well, and it's not good law in the sense that it is complicated, and in good law you should be able to understand it, even if you're not a developer or a planner. So I agree with all the comments, you know, Tyler and Tim and all. I've heard them through the Title 20 committee. I don't disagree with the problems that exist in Title 21. Many of them, I believe, that probably, like Tim said, we don't even know yet, because it is amazingly complex, and they're going to show up over time. The question that seems to be before us is a question of process. And you know, I'm not going to point fingers at all the people that came before me. I do have the benefit of being new, and I'm not as much to blame as others. But you know, this should have been worked on a long time ago. You know, the Title 21 committee. You know, Jennifer, I'm a big fan, but you know, one of the problems was the pace was too slow. I mean, we had that dual track, and then we extended that for a year, and you know, we're still not really close to getting all these things taking place. And like I told our new chair, I think you have to have meetings on that committee every week, and you have to deal with each of these issues as you go along. My between these 2 ordinances that are before us, and you know, I favor 76, I guess it is now, versus the other one, is simply because of that process. I don't know how you fix this problem in a reasonable way, but of all the alternatives I've seen, sitting in a room with the people that actually do the projects, with the planners that are looking to the future, with the assembly members, it seems to be the best way. It's tedious, and you know, I'm sure people will kill themselves over a period of time from sitting through them, but that seems to be the best approach, because these things are somewhat of a balance, and they need somewhat of a compromise. I mean, it isn't all one or the other. You know, the difference between 1.75 FAR and 2, you know, it's a judgment call in a lot of this. So what I think just really needs to happen is we need to establish a very concrete system for how we're going to fix this. I mean, I like what Ms. Dombrowski said about having P&Z at the table. I mean, there's a lot of process pieces we've discovered along the way, but it needs to happen faster. And I'm a little concerned about suspending the design standards in the meantime, simply because I've noticed in my brief tenure that when we take the pressure off the gas on these issues and we have no concrete wall in front of us, we tend to take our time again. In a way, I think it's better. I talk about the power of, the creative power of constraint a lot, and it's usually fiscally. But I think time is also an important constraint. So I like having that deadline. And if we don't get these things fixed by January 31st, or as many of them as we can, there's going to be problems when that new Title 21 is the only option for the developers. But even then, I don't think we'll get them all fixed. But it doesn't mean it's the end of the day. We're going to be fixing this thing for as long as it took to write it. So even, and it's going to have, there'll be projects that will be lost, I'm sure of it. But at some point, if we are diligent enough and we have a good process, we'll get to the point where we have a better functioning Title 21. But to me, the process is important. It's the only reason I'm not opposed. I salute Mr. Hall and Ms. Nabosky for their efforts and their frustration, but I think what's more important at this point is the process. That's it.
I mean, you're exactly where I was 5.5 years ago. Ms. Johnson?
Here?
So,
And we've got 3 minutes.
okay, quickly, I actually, when we were doing the Title 21 process, did not want to have commercial design standards, and I was really not excited about residential. So I'm kind of doing a little flip here, and I'm not, one of the things that Pal, I think, and I haven't looked at your complete coverage of the 2 ordinances, but we did do quite a bit of work on open space. I think you're right, just deleting those other, it's great, but we did have an opportunity. You're doing your due diligence and findings now. When you came in front of us, you didn't suggest this. So there's a lot that went into here that are some changes. If you look at the design standards, we made a lot of changes because I too have trouble with articulation, and I do like sort of the Scandinavian designs, and that's a different way of looking at a building than having the cookie cutter build out of a catalog kind of look. So I think there was work done into this. I think Ms. Dembowski can take her committee and tighten this up even better, having planning and zoning. But I think you have changes here that you wanted and you mentioned. And so I'm not quite sure if your ordinance is the way to go now that actually you have some of the changes in here. So anyway, that's it.
Mr. Potter, I know you're in the queue, but I am out of time. My final statement is it shouldn't be this complicated, and it shouldn't be this long.
Okay, I'll maybe a few minutes.
Mr. Training, the gavel is yours.
Thank you.
I have 1 minute, sir.
Take your time. Tim?
I just wanted to make it a hit, that I do want the community to know that Tyler and I are not trying to throw the baby out the bathwater. I think the town looks better now than it did in 1981 when I got here. And one of my frustrations is that the landscape, instead of adjusting the landscape ordinance 12 or 13 years ago at the start of the Title 21 stuff and doing the 6 things that would have really made a difference immediately, we've lost the last 13 years of having an updated landscaping plan, so the town could have had another decade of maturing the vegetation in a better way that would make us look even better. So, this timing thing, and I, Bill asked me to be very, very direct with him, and I was on the phone one day, and I called him naive to think that you could get changes done in the time frame you talked about. And I'm very concerned because now we are evidence that just the simple little changes that we tried to bring forward have been now in operation trying to change for 11 months. And, it's tough. But the real pitch I wanted to make at the end of the meeting is that good planning leads to good expenditures and actually saving money. And if we're looking for a sustainable, well-done, cost-effective community, there needs to be money spent, budgeted and spent, doing the right kind of planning for coordination of infrastructure and everything else. And I plead with you as the Assembly to do that. You know, I hit Jerry pretty hard. It's not all his fault. If you don't have the budget, the manpower, and you have too much work to do with the people that you have, and you can't go hire consultants, how the hell do you get the job done? And, you know, I bitch at him because he's in that position every day. But, you know, the reality is, I'm looking at you and telling you that with all the gray hair I still have left, we need to actually focus on doing some real long-range planning and coordinating the different things that make this planning work like other communities have done. And it takes a few dollars, but it will save us and pay us out in the future big time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Final thought
Amy?
is, all I would like to say is this isn't us against them. It's not Mr., you know, it's either me or Mr. Evans or me or Ms. Johnston or vice versa. I think there's pieces that are good parts and pieces of each that we bring to the table. And I think that's what we have to recognize. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. I mean, there's a lot to do. I'm sure we can pick good pieces out of both.
This meeting's over with. Thank you for being here.